Alrighty, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. It's our All Things Canada edition, All Things Native Lives Matter edition. So, who best than to have on our returning champion, Nakuset. Mrs. Nakuset is part of the Native Women's Shelter in Montreal, Quebec. And yes, we're here to talk about about all Indigenous matters related to Canada, hopefully international as well. And we're very strict for time, so I'm going to get straight into it. So first off, Mrs. Nakuset, thank you so much for coming back on the program. It's a real honor to have you back on the program.
Thanks for having me.
An honor to have you. And so yeah, so my first question is, there is big news. The passing of Murray Sinclair. Your thoughts on his passing, and any thoughts on his legacy, and for people who have absolutely no idea who even Murray Sinclair is, feel free to enlighten.
Yeah, well, that's another podcast. But anyway, so Murray Sinclair passed away. He was 73. He was everything. He was an Indigenous lawyer. He was the first Indigenous, or I think the second Indigenous judge. He started up so many different organizations, and he was also key to creating the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So he went around Canada for years getting testimony from Indigenous people who attended residential school and was able to put forward 94 calls to justice or calls to action. And so 10 years since it was implemented, and unfortunately, Canada has only implemented like 11. So, but I think that everyone knows that there are huge shoes to fill, and that, everything that he did so incredibly well. And there are so many people that have met him, that considered him a mentor. He was very close to Wab Kinew, and Wab Kinew is now the premier of Manitoba. And it was Murray Sinclair that pushed him or encouraged him to go into that line of work, because it's not easy. I would never be a politician, but like, it's not easy to go into that world. And Wab Kinew is incredibly successful in that role. So he broke a lot of barriers. He made an enormous amount of changes to the justice system. He was like key to the Gladue reports, which are reports that if you're an Indigenous person and you're about to be sentenced, all the lawyers have to fill out something called the Gladue report to show how colonialism has affected this person, and then the sentencing has to be amended.
Wow.
Unfortunately, yes, that's a Gladue report. Look it up. But the thing is that, the work that I do, I find that a lot of people or a lot of lawyers aren't willing to fill them out because it's too hard from them. So, so whenever we work with someone who's a lawyer, the first question I ask is, have you ever done a Gladue report? And if they say no, are you willing to? If you're not, we're going to find another lawyer. Or now a lot of, people in this field that are in the sort of social service field, they get the training on how to fill them out, so they do it on behalf of their client. But then, the lawyers are getting off scot-free by not, it is the law that they have to do it. But that's the problem. Like, you have a lot of calls to justice, calls to action, and it's lovely on paper. Nobody follows them. No one is enforcing them to do it. So I guess it gets frustrating. But so we need to have some kind of change.
It's interesting because people talk a lot. Advocates. They could be Indigenous advocates. They could be Black Lives Matter type of advocates. And even those, of like the Red Power movement or the American Indian movement, talk a lot of what we call social justice or racial justice. It sounds to me, but a lot of that is just is a lot of talk, but not a lot of that stuff is actually done in practice because
Hmm.
of well, because we are the marginalized group that's so far away from power. But it sounds to me as if this Gladue report, that's some social racial justice in action, is it not?
If the lawyer does it, you know what I'm saying? A lot of them are like, "What's a Gladue report?" I'm like, "Oh my God." I mean, from what I understand, because people or lawyers were not actually applying the Gladue reports, there was another um, I don't have the technical term. There was another law called the Epile law. And the Epile law says you have to do the Gladus. They're still not doing it. So that's what makes it so hard. We have these incredible sort of justice initiatives that could be followed by those in a position of power, and they are ignoring it. So, you know, anyway,
Interesting.
whatever.
Well, rest in power to Murray Sinclair, and and may that positive legacy may it continue to inspire more
Yeah.
people in the quest for not just more troops but justice, because as John Pilger would say, you cannot have reconciliation without justice. So let me ask you then this question, which is how in general how in general are the state of affairs regarding Indigenous people in Quebec, where you're based? I'm curious because I know we've had you on the program a couple of times, and you have spoken about how the current premier is not exactly, he's colorblind. So I'm curious, how are things in Quebec currently right now when it comes to the state of Indigenous affairs?
Same thing. You know what's really alarming actually is that there it seems to be like it's open season right now on Indigenous people because I did a
Wow.
um yeah, I did a vigil for I think within a 2 week period there was something like seven Indigenous people across Canada that were shot by either the local police, the RCMP, and no accountability. And then last weekend, two Inuit twins were shot by the RCMP. One died, the other one is in the hospital. So I think the number now, it was originally six, it's gone up to 11. So, and this is something where like we have different politicians that are, in the House of Commons, and they are bringing it to the attention. Like, why is this happening? When are you going to do something about it? But nothing really happens. We don't have accountability, and it's really bad. So there is no response from the RCMP about this. They feel like, oh, well, the BEI has to get involved and we'll get back to you. But it really feels like at the end of the day, there's no accountability. I believe it was in September that we did the vigil for, six Indigenous people. One was like a wellness check. One was like a 15-year-old. Like it's crazy how they just keep getting away with it. And I guess at the end of the day, if you don't have, the premier saying anything about it, or the prime minister, or if there is any kind of investigation from a higher power, if the cops are not being, off with, on a leave until an investigation, it just shows that it's fine to keep shooting Indigenous people. So that is one of the most concerning things. I mean, there's a lot of concerning things, but that is one of them. I think that, here in Quebec, or at least where I live in Montreal, there's a high there's a high number of Indigenous homeless people that have passed away. And I know with Resilience Montreal, we did a memorial for something like 37, and that was again, I think that was in August, and there's another six that I just passed on. So now we have to do another memorial, and it's of concern. And a lot of the people that are dying are very young. They're young. A lot of them are women that are dying. So yeah, we have challenges.
Yeah, and uh, that's actually a perfect segue then to this question, which is what is the current state when it comes to the murdered and missing Indigenous women epidemic, and yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we're quite involved, the Native Women's Shelter, because we have the Ishkwe project on missing and murdered Indigenous women. But, I was at the inquiry, and I testified for 3 days. So we know that there's 231 calls to justice. They've applied one.
231 calls to justice.
That's what they call it. After the inquiry was done, they had a huge report, 231 calls to justice. That was in 2019. It's 2024. They've done one. One? I'm like, oh, we feel like you really care about us. Like,
Yeah.
does that mean we have to wait another 230 years for you to do the rest? Right? So it gets really frustrating because about like the 85 or 83, calls to action from the TRCs and the 230 calls to justice for MMIW. There's not a lot of movement. I know recently they're in the process of trying to have a red dress alert, which would be equivalent to an amber alert. Our team was able to sit in with some people, like politicians, to talk about what is the best way to do this, how do we do this, just like a consultation. And it looks like it's going to be happening, like it's closer to happening, but there is no data as to when it's going to happen. Problematic, I mean, if the police, the police are killing us, they get a call about a red dress, and we're like, I don't know. Anyways, I don't mean to be.
But actually funny that you mentioned that. I've recently I've been trying to watch these two documentaries about the infamous Canadian serial killer Robert Pickton. Now, wasn't Robert Pickton part of the well, didn't the series of murders he did, and the fact that the police kind of like the Jeffrey Dahmer scandal in the
Hmm.
United States, the police actually were very much implicated in not doing enough to apprehend him when they could have. And there's even some allegations that the police kind of knew what Robert Picton was up to. There, ergo, that led to the big investigations of murdered and missing Indigenous women. Was Robert Picton a one-off, or is there a whole bunch of systemic issues at play? Given how uh, grossly incompetent, grossly negligent the police were. Uh, yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, Robert Pickton, we just heard in the news that when he had his trial, all the evidence, they're going to burn it. They're going to destroy it. And we're like, wait a minute, because it feels like yes, he was guilty of what he did, but he colluded with others. We'll never know now if you burn everything who the others were, right? I think that the whole idea of serial killers for Indigenous women is still out there, just in Manitoba. Thankfully, now that we have an Indigenous, premier in Manitoba, there's a landfill where there's, a couple of Indigenous women who've been murdered that they strongly believe the remains are there, and he is in the process of going through, the landfill and bringing in experts to find the remains. For before he was elected, nobody wanted to do it. No, but you see on TV that they do it all the time. I don't like it's crazy. Like there's a real like ill will to do better for Indigenous people. And it's really hard to push them to, follow a recommendation. They'll do the reports, they'll spend the money, and it's like, okay, you had your say, now shut up now. We're going to put these, like recommendations on a shelf. We're not going to force anyone to read them. We're not going to force anyone to apply them. We're just going to ignore them. Go along your way. It's I find it discouraging.
Interesting. But with Wab Canoe, who you've been speaking very highly of, I have some criticism of Wab Canoe. But before I even but before I talk about
Yeah, listen, I didn't say it was perfect. I heard those criticisms myself, but
okay,
in
okay,
his
so that being said, is Wab Canoe as being the NZB premier of
Manitoba,
Manitoba.
Manitoba,
So
yep.
is what he's doing right now? Is he actually doing the work that other premiers have been given? This is the recommendations of murdered and missing Indigenous women. This is this is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Do it, and if premiers don't do it, they don't do it. But Wab Canoe is actually doing it, is he not?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. He's doing some of the work. And, like I said, I would never be a politician. I think that anyone who's Indigenous working for the government, you're not gonna you're not gonna get very far. You can do it in baby steps. I don't think so. I don't think so. At the end of the day, that you can make, slight changes, but no, I feel like in my work I can make much more changes than I ever would as a politician because you have to, you know, follow their rules. And if you step out of line, if they're not comfortable with the change, they'll fire you, shut you down, whatever, right? So, anyways, but power to him. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm
No, no,
not saying don't do it. I'm just saying
exactly. No, no,
there's got to be a better way.
no. But that's why I thought it was quite interesting your positive assessment of him, and I'm not even going to actually talk about my criticism of his.
Yeah, moving
Good
on.
on him.
Moving on.
Then I have to, so then I have to ask this question. Uh, Now, as a survivor of the '60s scoop, I've always been curious something about the '60s scoop because you had some Indigenous Canadians that were sent to the United States to be adopted, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah, they say there's about 20 there's a book called Stolen from Our Embrace by Ernie Cray and Suzanne Fournier. And in their book, they talk about there is if you filled up like the whole city of Seattle, that's how many Indigenous people or that's how many Indigenous people that were living in Canada or from Canada were shipped over to the United States. So there's a
but
lot.
but what about the Native Americans, like the Native Americans who are taken into care, Native American children who are taken into care? Like I just find that so weird because Native American children are notorious for being swept up in a very racist social care system and are sometimes given to very wealthy non-indigenous families and so forth. And I just find it so weird that you would take indigenous children from Canada, flood them into the United States when we already have uh yeah.
But it was a different kind of policy because the social workers who were able to find homes in the United States for people who could not have children, got five to $20,000 per child. That's the difference. It was wealthy Americans that, wanted a child and were willing to pay. And yeah,
and yet
look it up. I'm not making it up.
and yet and yet it was a humongous, well, it was successful in that it was another racist like assault on indigenous people, but not successful in the fact that they weren't, that many people weren't happy in the families that they were forcibly adopted, right?
I know that 85% of the adoptions failed.
Yeah.
There are some people that were adopted that had, wonderful parents and had a great upbringing. But I think the culture shock was what was most difficult for Indigenous children and having to sort of lie about who you are, right? Or having a really negative perception. I worked in this television series that's on Crave, and I think it's you can see it in the United States as well, called Little Bird. And a it's about an Ojibwe child that was adopted by a Jewish family in Westmount. So when Jennifer Podemsky, who
So
is
so
the
so so
showrunner,
so Ojibwe, that would be an indigenous person from Minnesota then, right? So
Ojibwe is also Canadian. There's
okay,
Canadian
okay.
Ojibways or Anishinabes, what is the proper term. But in the person who was creating the series, they saw my documentary Becoming Nakuset, and they hired me to be a cultural or a consultant on the film or on the TV series. So it's like no, it's a 6-part miniseries. Devastating to watch. It is so hard to watch, and it's based like in the 1980s, but it shows all the layers of racism against Indigenous people, why they took these children, because a lot of the times there was no need to take them, but it was an assimilation process, right? I mean, you get cut off from your community. So, like, the government is supposed to give, each Indigenous child, like monies because of the treaties. Oh, wait, let me even tell you something even funnier. It's not even funny, okay? But definitely, if you can watch Little Bird, watch it and have lots of Kleenex. The government is so good at screwing us over that my community, Lac La Ronge, sued the government and won because back in the day in 1876, when they were supposed to, sort of honor the treaties, and, each native child was supposed, or each native family was supposed to get one cow, one plow, one scythe, a bag of this, a bag of that. I mean, it's all written down. And the government never implemented it. And this is how a lot of Indigenous people ended up starving, and they weren't allowed to utilize the land because of different Indian Act things. Anyway, in Canada, all the different nations are suing the government. My government or my band got $601 million. So what happens with that money is, they divide it up. Some of it's going to the community, but each community member can get up to $35,000. Like my kids are going to get $35,000. I have to explain that to my children. I'm like, yeah, you're going to get some money. Why? Well, because the government screwed you over and then we sued them and, they feel bad. So, or they have to. Like, it's crazy. It's crazy, right? Anyways, the kids don't get it till they're 21. So I don't have to worry about them going crazy with it. But like, what a world, right? Like, the government has really done everything besides, not feeding us, not honoring treaties, taking the children, shipping them out to United States, shipping them with families, separation of the culture. We were not supposed to retrace our steps. That was the whole thing about the 60s scoop. A lot of us did. We found out who our family is, and then we become band members again. The government's like, ugh, now I gotta like they give us $5 a year for being an Indian. Now that was in 1876 again. You didn't think like inflation? $5 in 1876 was a lot of money. Now, so there's certain communities that are again, trying to sue the government to be like, listen, buddy, you owe us a lot more than just $5, right? Anyway, whatever. I'm going on a tangent. What's your next
That's
question?
I just find that so crazy, and I just find that even more crazy that the government would say, okay, we're going to do a kind of a unique. I mean, we're already doing residential schools, but let's do something even more evil, which is the '60s scoop, and let's
Yeah.
ship them to our settler colonial kindred spirit that is the United States, who also treat their indigenous people like dirt and break up families in unjust social care systems, and then be like, here, wealthy family, there's a Native American you can adopt. Well, here, we'll give you a Canadian.
Well, it's the parents that want it, right?
What comes to the mind of somebody like that?
I don't know.
Unbelievable. And but that leads to two things about residential schools I wanted to ask you about. Are we seeing a rise in residential school in residential school denialism or residential school minimalism, and if that is the case, why do you think it is very important? Leah Kazan, a very well known leftish NDP MP of Indigenous background is trying to, pass a law that says no to residential school minimalism slash denialism.
Yeah, like she's trying to make it like a law that if you do it, that there'll be a penalty to it. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago with Kimberly Murray. So Kimberly Murray was the special interlocutor on missing children and mass graves, and she had her final gathering, and she had a panel on denialism and how hurtful it is, and like people that are in the process of, finding on their communities these, residential schools with gray sites, trying to, you know do what they can to find records, or, just trying to identify. They get like death threats from other Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians. Like they get death threats. Like it is so bad. I know Kimberly Murray said that she has received death threats herself just for bringing the truth forward, right? That people don't want to know. And I think that, almost, I think any kind of type of genocide has a tendency for people to have denialists. I mean, you've heard it, there's a lot of people who don't believe the Holocaust ever happened, right? Like we know it happened, but I don't know what feeds those people to want to deny, but it doesn't mean that we sort of I mean, we have to keep telling our truth. That's what we have to keep doing, and we have to sort of find a way that it goes into the history books, because I know that um you know residential schools are now in, like, my kids, like my grade 6 kid, he'll have a little bit in his history books about it, but not a lot, right? And he definitely doesn't have anything about mass graves. Nothing, right? So I think that when all this news came out about mass graves, a lot of people were shocked across the world. But if you read the TRCs, it was always in there. So Indigenous people are like, but we told you. We told you many times. It's in the report. Why are you so like outraged now when we have been telling you for 10 years, right? So I don't know what it is about all these reports that people just don't read them. It's too hard. Oh, I gotta lift the page. Ah, I hurt my finger. Like, I don't know what it is, but there's a real kind of complacency in not learning and not understanding and not having empathy. And it's multi-level, right? So it's like maybe the teachers that are getting it from the Ministry of Education, that's getting it from the Prime Minister or the Premier, and then the Prime Minister, maybe King Charles.
I have to. Well, I didn't want to bring this up. I have to bring this up. But you are aware of a newspaper called the National, the National Burn Toast, or the National Post, and
Yeah.
its media chains of Post Media and the I think their local branch in Quebec would be the Montreal. Well, anyways, but yeah, you're familiar with the National Post, and oh
Yep.
my God, the kind of stuff they have been saying about residential schools is just downright disgusting. I recently read one of their contributors was pissing on the grave of Murray Sinclair, and it was just so disgusting. Like Murray Sinclair, like how dare he talk about our precious John McDonald and stuff
Oh
like
God.
that, and it's just like, and but of course of course that's the extreme end. Like everybody knows that the national that the National Post is is this waste of ink. It's like the Daily Mail, New York Post, or like Daily Telegraph of Canada. But the fact of the matter is, people do read it, and it is the biggest newspaper chain in Canada, and and it's not behind a paywall, unlike the Globe and Mail and some of the more other quote unquote respectable liberal media outlets.
Mm.
I'm so I'm curious your thoughts on that, and And also, when we talk about residential school denialism or residential school minimalism, you know, having I saw Stephen Harper's big apology, which I think was fairly well, and all of the other opposition leaders, their apologies, and the big ceremony that they had with the indigenous groups and leaders and folks that they invited to apologize for residential schools. But there was always something about Stephen Harper's apology which still kind of got under my skin. Like residential schools, like were not wonderful places that you ship the children. Like they were evil places. They were evil
Mhm.
places of systemic child abuse and whatnot. And yet Stephen Harper still felt the need to say some kids at residential schools had good experience, but the vast majority had and then that's I and that just like really pisses me off because no, dude, like no one had a good time at residential schools. These were awful, like literal torture chambers for indigenous children. So if we're going after residential school denialism, would we also be going after those like bizarre like just full on fake news like when they say that some kids had a good experience at residential schools?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there was a book called Indian School Days by Basil Johnson, and he went to a residential school called Spanish, which was notorious for being so abusive. His book was only about good things. Maybe Stephen Harper read it, right? Got a lot of criticism for it, right? So yes, I mean, I'm sure, out of like, 100 nuns, maybe one was nice. I don't know, right? But the thing is that once, Stephen Harper came into power, the Native Women's Shelter, he cut the funding for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. So actions speak louder than words. That was funding to support residential school survivors and, intergenerational survivors like myself, because my mother went to residential school. If you had residential schools for over 100 years, then you should have funding for over 100 years, right? Because I think they were still, grappling with, the effects of residential school. Like I can't speak my language. I was adopted by a Jewish family. I speak Hebrew. Like that's not reconciliation. You know? Anyway, that's assimilation.
Yeah, exactly. And I have to ask this now. Normally I don't like asking Canadians to dump on the United States and so forth. I think there's a whole industry of that, but I do ask this question sometimes to Canadian guests, which is, when is America going to get to the level Canada is at when it comes to dealing and reckoning with its settler colonial past? And recently, my friend Robert Eggington said to me, "Hey, Youri, did you hear the big news in the U.S.?" What big news? Joe Biden is apologizing for residential schools, and I thought, oh my god! Now I've not had a chance to see Joe Biden's full apology, but this is historic. A president apologizing for residential schools. By the way, I was never taught about residential schools, and I had a very good teacher who really emphasized and really showed us how awful settler colonialism was. But the funny thing was this: I think she engaged in self censorship when teaching us, because she would teach us about how, yes, Native Americans died from smallpox, but she never told us how the white man settlers intentionally poison people. So again, and I never learned about like residential schools. So I'm curious your thoughts on Joe Biden's apology to to residential school survivors in the U.S. And when do you think the U.S. will get to the level Canada is at in terms of reckoning with its settler colonial past, it being more solidarity from the left given to the plight of Indigenous people and so forth?
Uh, Listen, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, what came with the apology? Like when when they, when Harper and everyone else did their apology, In Canada, it came with monetary, right? So each residential school survivor had to go, which was excruciating, had to go in front of like a um, almost like a jury to explain, the abuse in detail. And they literally marked off what that would be financially, like if you were raped, you got more money than if you were just beaten, if you got pregnant and they threw the baby in a fire, which they did, you got more money. And it was just really, really traumatic. But, people that went to residential school got a payout for it. Is Biden doing that? I don't know. Like, I think that if you give apology, it should come with something because I'm sorry. Yeah, right. Sorry for what? Right?
Well,
What are you doing to reverse it? What are you doing to make changes? That's what I would like to see.
but they're also well, I'll also just say this as a criticism of the U.S. left. This is I often say this. I wish that I wish that we could export America's anti-imperialism into Canada because Canada needs an anti-imperialist, anti-war movement. But I wish that we could export the kind of solidarity your people get from from the non-indigenous left. I wish we could export that into America because I think that the American people power movements don't do enough to show more urgent solidarity to indigenous people. But that being said, uh, I've noticed that like a lot of Americans have not bought into the whole land acknowledgement thing because they find it's just so empty to do land acknowledgments if you're not really going to give any to Native Americans. So I'm curious your thoughts on that because a lot of the Americans I talk to say like, look, yeah, I know that the Canadians and the Australians do it, but like, dude, like we're so full of shit when we do it. And like, no, like it's so empty. So I'm
It is
curious your thoughts
empty.
on that.
It is empty. I mean, I know they always do it, but what does it mean? I mean, like, can it come with some action? Besides knowing that you're on Mohawk territory or you're on Anishinaabe territory or you're on what, like, and what? He gonna pay us rent? Like what? I don't know, but they feel like that's, the thing to do. So whatever. It's, it's a phase or whatever. It'll be something else, in a year.
Well,
I
they
don't
said,
know.
I think I always loved this. Amy McQuire, this brilliant young Aboriginal journalist. She was a researcher on John Pilger's documentary Utopia, who was like my hero in journalism and wanting to speak out more on indigenous things. I believe she once wrote an article for New Matilda about the stolen generations in Australia, and I think the title of the article was "Sorry is the easiest word, compensation is the hardest."
Yeah. Love that. Seriously.
Because Kevin Rudd, who did a brilliant apology, he did a very nice apology to the Aboriginal people and was promising so much stuff that there was going to finally there was going to be no more apartheid in the education system. Everybody would get equal funding, yada yada yada, and so forth. But then he said off the record to somebody of the press when there was a bunch of press people asking him all sorts of questions. He said, I want to be very blunt about this. There will be no compensation. And that's just shocking because the anti-slavery society in Australia, the whole bringing them home reports about the stolen generations and the intergenerational trauma that it was already having on people, explicitly said that the government needs to apologize and compensate the victims, and there just hasn't been
Mm.
none of that in Australia, which is and if you think the situation is bad in the U.S. and in Canada, wow, Australia is just a whole nother can of unbelievable racism and just systemic injustice that goes on to indigenous people, but I'm curious your thoughts on the one on the Aboriginal Senator Lydia Thorpe and her protesting of King Charles's visit.
Love it. Love it.
Love
That
it.
was awesome. Yeah, great. Like, woo! We got to get her on our side. I mean, we're worlds away, but we face the same kind of, challenges. So I thought it was great.
Fantastic. And two last questions. The two last questions I have to ask you is, if there was an election tomorrow in Canada, and Justin Trudeau was unseated and replaced by Pierre Poilievre, what do you think would be Justin Trudeau's legacy, specifically when it comes to race relations between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, uh, settler colonialism, and so forth?
Justin Trudeau?
Yeah.
Ugh. Listen, I think that the guy, when he went into politics, this was when, NWAC, so Native Women's Association of Canada, was really pushing to have an inquiry. And he kind of got like the Indian vote because he's like, if you elect me, I'll give you an inquiry. But who cares? You gave us an inquiry. You don't follow the 231 calls to justice. So you're full of crap. So I don't really have very much to say about Justin Trudeau. Sorry.
Interesting. Interesting. And do you think we will see more Indigenous action in the United States and solidarity in the United States when it comes to dealing with just everything and anything when it comes to the colonial past and and the injustices of today?
I don't know. You're talking about the states. The politics are so different. And, Canada has different treaties. I remember once meeting, like in Florida, um, you know, uh, sorry, I forget the name of the tribe that I met. But we were just having a discussion about, like my treaty allows me to have post-secondary education, right? And they were like, we don't get that. So we were like comparing, like, what does your government do for you, right? Ah, what is the name of the nation that lives in Florida with the alligators? I bought a book. I went to their powwow. I bought a book. Anyways, I
It's
forgive
okay.
me if we
It's
get
okay. It's okay. You'll have to remember.
nation.
You'll have to remember.
You figure it out, and then you can do a little edit at the end. What she went was this nation. Anyways, but yeah, so I don't know very much about the politics there and how things differ, but I know that, in Canada, every, chiefs fought for different things, and that's why there's all different kinds of treaties throughout Canada so that we have to uh, get our own compensation for everything that they took, right? I don't know how it works down there. I don't think that they got those kind of or any treaties. So it would be nice if the government were to do something better. But, look who you have in power now. So good luck with that. Come on over to Canada.
Exactly. Yeah. 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 Exactly. But I will say this: having been to Western Australia, Perth, that my friend Robert Egging says, the most racist place, the most racist city in the most racist country on the face of the planet Earth. It's how he describes Perth in Australia. When asking him about solidarity work and coalition building that Aboriginal Australians have with other Indigenous people, he says that there needs to be far more of that. That there actually isn't a lot of that happening, even though
Mm,
even though Australian history is similar, identical,
mhm.
like there's not much difference between Australia and the plights that both Canadians and Native Americans, and to a degree, the Maori of New Zealand. So he would like that, that there needs to be much more solidarity, because he says that right now in Australia, after the defeat of the referendum, says that we have finally gotten to the point where we need international help and international solidarity to deal
Yep.
with apartheid Australia,
Yep.
because it is no longer, because it's just not going to come from why Australia would rejected a very, very, tiny change to the Constitution that just would have given, them like, a consultancy voice in
Mm.
Parliament. So,
I
but
think we should all come together. We're just so
yes,
busy with other things, It's sort of like the micro versus the macro. Like, in a perfect world, we would all come together. And I don't think it won't happen. I'm just not sure when. Yeah.
and before I end, Miss Nakuset, is there anything you want to plug? I know there is a particular thing you want to plug. Uh,
Oh,
before but
so yeah.
before we wrap up.
Okay, so I'll try to do this really quickly because I know you're going to give them the information that so the Native Women's Shelter and Amnesty International have come together with an enormous group of I guess knowledge keepers and lawyers because you know how I talked about being really frustrated with all the calls to justice and calls to action being ignored, and residential school denialism. I think that if we want to push forward with all these initiatives, the only way we can do this, because most Canadians are not really aware of what has happened with our history, Indigenous history, is to have something called a permanent People's Tribunal. And we will have one in Montreal. So 2026 in Montreal, we've invited a permanent People's Tribunal. So at least 6 judges to come down from Rome. That's where the permanent People's Tribunal is based. They've been around for 50 years. And we had to write them asking if they would come to Canada to look at crimes against humanity that the government and the churches did against Indigenous people. And we are looking at, the crimes against humanity and also genocide for the missing Indigenous children in mass graves. And we have an opportunity to have 5 days where we can look at residential schools, also the churches and other institutions, and portray portray the truth by offering evidence, whether it be documents or even testimony, to show the judges what happened here, and for the judges to make their own judgment and to tell the government what they think. And it's an amazing opportunity. And the PPT has only come to Canada 3 times. They've been all over the world, but only in Canada 3 times. I got to meet with Jasmine, who did a PPT on murdered journalists. They did in 3 different countries, and they have a short like YouTube video that showed what it was like. So if you can find it, just look up PPT on YouTube on murdered journalists, because it really shows you how powerful it could be. And I feel like as an Indigenous person, if I have the capacity to bring the truth out, for the judges to share their insight about what Canada has done to Indigenous people. And I mean, it stems from the Indian Act, residential school. There are so many different crimes against humanity, like, forced displacement, having the RCMP take the children by force, putting the parents in jail if they didn't allow their children, moving them, like across the country, because none of the residential schools were always very, very far away. The idea of what happened with the mass graves, the collusion involved between the churches, the Indian agent, and the government, because if you have 851 graves, that's a lot of, hush hush, and a whole, like there was a whole system that was allowed. And zip, and now that it's come to light, let's bring in the Europeans to get their opinion on it and see how we can make some change. So that's what I'm doing. It's called, we have a website, so feel free to take a look at it. It's pretty incredible. And we'll have more news later. right? We're just at the beginning, 2026, but we already have a group of lawyers. Kimberly Murray is going to be one of our expert witnesses, as well as Fanny Lafontaine. So we're in the process of pulling in all this information, and the indictment is going to King Charles. Maybe I'll have Lydia present it.
Well,
Okay.
good friend of the show, Alfred Desire, says that there needs to be a Native Lives Matter movement, but
Mm,
not just that, that there needs to be an international solidarity movement to
yeah.
Indigenous people of the settler colonial states of Australia, New Zealand, and the United States and Canada, and I would even argue the Sami people as well. So here's hoping that happens, and
It will
uh,
happen.
off the air, I'll get you the contact information of of my good friend Robert Eggington, so that y'all in Canada and the Aboriginals in in Australia can start doing that solidarity work. So
Well, the thing is that we might need to pull in different indigenous groups that had a lived experience to show crimes against humanity. It would be super powerful. So, and if you watch that video, you'll see they had like a screen for the murdered journalists of people from across the country that were giving testimony. So yeah, like
so
it's gonna be
exciting.
good.
So exciting times ahead in the fight for justice. Then,
Yep. Yep.
well, we were joined on this. On that note, we were joined on this edition of 1+1. It's been a long time since we've done it, but our All Things Native Lives Matter episode, All Things Canada, with Mrs. Nakuset, who is part of the Native Women's Memorial Shelter. See how tired I am.
Native Women's Shelter of Montreal.
See how tired I am? I'm completely blanking out on all of that stuff. So that Mrs. Nakuset, once again, thank you so much for being a returning champion. Best of luck in all the work you do, and always free to come on 1+1 to give us all of the updates and so forth. All right.
All right.
Ciao.
Thank you.